Desiluze, outubro 6, 1944. Peenemünde Airfield lay half awake under a thin veil of fog. The runway was a dark seam. Men moved like shadows along its edge, faces lit by lamp and cigarette. A thin ribbon of vapor hung where the comet's tanks met the cold air. Heine Dittmar sat in the cockpit, gloved hands on the tiny control column, his breath fogging the canopy. He listened to the instruments and to his own heart. The rocket's idle hiss was like the animal under a skin, patient, dangerous, ready. If you like deep dives into aviation history, stay with us until the end. Subscribe and like if this kind of technical storytelling speaks to you. Heine checked the strap, fingers that had learned to steady themselves on the edge of disaster. "Ready," he said to no one and everyone. A ground mechanic tipped a lantern, a signalman waved his arm. The trolley fell away. The comet shoved and then shoved harder. The runway blurred. Acceleration pinned Dittmar back into the seat. The world narrowed to wind and needle and a single white strip of sky ahead. The Me-163 comet was not built to loiter. It was a rocket, short, brilliant, and terrifying. Fuel-fed fury gave it bursts of speed beyond piston-driven fighters, but only for a handful of minutes. In flight, it felt like a heart racing past reason. Instruments climbed, altimeter rose in slow, decisive increments, 3,000 meters, 6,000 meters. The horizon peeled away. Dittmar watched the fuel gauge bite into red. He had learned the arithmetic of survival. Climb fast, intercept, aim, and then glide home before the tanks were empty or the engine cooled into silence. The climb was a promise and a threat. A rocket provided unmatched thrust and unmatched risk. The comet could touch velocities that made escorting fighters look stationary. Claims varied, but test runs suggested bursts approaching the high hundreds of kilometers per hour, with some runs recording peaks that rivaled early jet numbers. Those bursts meant the comet could appear, shoot, and vanish. It was speed as a weapon, absolute and surgical. Yet that same speed severed the margin for error. Every second shaved off fuel meant another second further from a safe airfield. Heine's takeoff was textbook until the needle flirted with a number no pilot wanted to see. Fuel flow erratic. He killed the power and felt the aircraft go soft beneath him. The climb turned into a glide. The hush of the engine was a curse. He watched the thin white contrail of a Heinkel bomber far below, a small drifting island of metal. He had to choose a field. He thought of the men who kept the strip, of the crews who stoked the furnace of the rocket's life. He thought too of the design that made such choices necessary. Rocket propulsion solved the problem, top speed, but it invited another, endurance. Across the channel, a different philosophy took shape. In the summer of 1944, a P-51 Mustang climbed on a long, steady beat toward the bomber stream. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine sang with a sustained, reliable power. It did not promise flashes of speed the way rocket planes did. It promised time, range, endurance, the ability to stay with heavy bombers across hundreds of kilometers, to escort and protect. The Mustang's top-end speed, often quoted in the 300 to 700 kilometers per hour range at altitude, mattered less than its ability to be where the war demanded it, time after time. It was endurance as strategy.
The story of WW2 air power is, in large part, the story of these conflicting philosophies. There were men who chased absolute speed, believing that higher top velocities would make existing defenses obsolete. There were others who valued the arithmetic of missions, fuel load, range, maintainability, ease of repair, and the ability to amass numbers in service. The Comet and the Me-262, the rocket and the early jet, offered glimpses of a future shaped by speed. The Mustang and other piston fighters offered the harsher pragmatism of attrition and logistics. Haney guided the quiet Comet down onto a field of churned earth. The landing was a slow, brittle negotiation. The glide home felt like returning a wounded animal to its den. Ground crews ran forward once he came to rest, faces lit by relief and a professional fearfulness that bordered on reverence. Fuel lines were cut. Men with cloth masks edged closer. They had learned, the hard way, that the hypergolic propellants the rocket used, compounds that burn on contact and ate at materials the way salt eats iron, left no margin for casual handling. A fueling accident could kill a mechanic outright and burn their clothing off, leaving chemical injuries that required immediate and desperate attention. The memory of such accidents hung over every launch like a cloud. In a workshop lit by a single tungsten bulb, Alexander Lippisch, the engineer who had pushed rocket and tailless glider designs for a decade, watched reports come in from test flights. He wrote numbers on a blackboard: climb rates, burnout durations, mass fractions. He argued, softly at first, then more sharply, about whether thrust could be tamed into something operationally useful. Speed, he told a junior engineer, is an answer only if you can use it to change outcomes. He drew a crude diagram of intercept windows and energy budgets. Engineers measured advantage not just in kilometers per hour, but in seconds of energy advantage at the moment of attack, and in the fuel costs of getting there. Contrast that with the men in the Mustang maintenance tents. Simple jacks, grease-streaked hands, scrapings of patched sheet metal. The Merlin engine service routine was demanding but familiar. Parts could be manufactured in large numbers. Pilots could be trained to fly formations. Ground crews could be rotated. Logistics, the mundane arithmetic of war, favored designs that could be produced, repaired, and flown in quantity.
Speed mattered only when it could be counted on repeatedly. The Me-262 entered that argument with an awkward, dangerous middle voice. A turbojet fighter, it flew faster than most piston fighters and arrived too late to change the war's outcome. Early production delays, fuel shortages, and doctrinal confusion. Should it be used as a high-speed interceptor or as a fighter-bomber, meant its strategic impact was halting. When it engaged Allied formations, it displayed a terrifying speed advantage in straight flight and a heavy, vulnerable moment in the landing and takeoff phases, when the jet's thin margins opened it to attack. The 262 taught a blunt lesson. Speed without supporting systems, maintenance, spare parts, trained pilots, and fuel cannot alone win the field. There were moments when the raw physics of velocity produced small miracles. A Comet pilot climbing past 10,000 meters, about 33,000 feet, in minutes, could close on a bomber at a rate that allowed a single decisive pass. Rockets and jets introduced a new energy calculus into aerial combat. Pilots learned to use energy, speed and altitude as currency to dictate engagements. Yet the same currency, spent imprudently or without return, left one bankrupt
over hostile territory. One winter morning over the Norwegian fjords, Chuck Gerger led a flight of Mustangs on a long-range escort. The ocean below was a mirror of slate. Gerger's aircraft was steady, a platform he trusted. His squadron's orders were blunt: keep the bombers safe. They would eat fuel for hours. They would return if any could still fly. In the end, their contribution was simple: presence. Enemy fighters had less room to menace a bomber formation that had reliable, persistent cover. Gerger trusted predictability. He trusted his radio and his wingmen. This contrast, speed as a singular advantage versus reliability as an operational multiplier, would define many of the war's air engagements. But technical minutiae also produced intimate human dramas. A test run in the Comat could mean 2 minutes at full throttle and then hours of anxious gliding, counting altitudes, and praying for a friendly field. An engine surge in a jet on approach could mean the difference between a safe rollout and a crash in which fuel ignites the airfield. In the cramped cockpit, with throttle and trim knobs at hand, pilots faced the intersection of their training and the machine's fragile realities. Back at Peenemünde, a briefing room smelled of ink and stale coffee. A map of Britain spread across a table. Engineers argued over production figures and fuel allocations. A young logistics officer pointed to rail bottlenecks. "You can have the fastest aircraft in the world," he said, voice steady, "but if you cannot move it to the front, it is a museum piece." The room nodded. Speed lived within a web: fuel type and availability, runway length and condition, maintenance crew skill, and the pilot's ability to predict and survive margin loss. There were costly experiments in the middle. Pilots flying captured or prototype jets and rockets told stories that read like parables of promise and limitation. A test pilot would climb into a miracle of thrust, perform the prescribed maneuvers, record the peak speed, then file back to hangar and note how many maintenance hours the flight had consumed. Engineers would tally the hours and decide whether the cost per sortie justified further investment. Speed had its own maintenance invoice. On a late autumn evening in a bombed-out airfield, a Comet returned without its pilot. The ground crew found the canopy open and the seat empty. Heine Dittmar had ejected, if that word can be applied to the simple trapdoor exits of rocket craft, or had been forced to leave in a hurry. The reasons were not always recorded cleanly. Sudden fuel feed problems, a structural flutter at high speed, or the human error born of exhaustion. The loss stung. It reminded men that machines and pilots formed a fragile system. Take out one link and the rest could unravel. The Me-262's arrival came with its own human cost. Test pilots pushing the limits experienced compressor stalls, flameouts, and unfamiliar throttle lag. Engines sometimes failed on takeoff, turning a short field into a lethal trap. Pilots trained on piston engines found the jet's response curve foreign. Training pipelines had to be altered, and in wartime, those alterations came at the cost of fewer experienced pilots at the front. The 262 Speed was a tactical asset, but strategic utility required infrastructure that wartime Germany increasingly lacked. Between these extremes stood innovations that hinted at the future rather than altering the present. The Bell X-1, a rocket plane that would later break the sound barrier in controlled, instrumented tests, was born of a different impulse: curiosity paired with method. It represented the post-war continuation of the race for speed. but in a research framework that emphasized controlled experimentation, repeatable data, and survivable margins. The X-1's achievement in 1947 would confirm that aerodynamic regimes could be mastered, not merely braved. In the wartime years, though, such systematic research was a luxury. Strategically, the war's air campaigns demonstrate a clear pattern. Commanders who could sustain operations, maintain aircraft at scale and with predictability, tended to achieve more than those who possessed occasional technological marvels. The Mustang's ability to escort bombers across Europe transformed strategic bombing from a punitive, high-loss endeavor into an increasingly effective campaign. The jets and rockets, dazzling as they were, could not be produced and deployed in time, abundantly enough, to change the tide. At the same time, those late-war experiments left a legacy beyond the immediate conflict. Jet propulsion, rocket-assisted takeoffs, and new material science would transform aviation in the post-war years.
Engineers who wrestled with the comet's combustion instability or the 262's turbine metallurgy laid groundwork for the jet age. Pilots who learned to manage energy in high-speed engagements taught future generations lessons about maneuvering and survivability. The war thus accelerated a technological learning curve that, once the pressures of combat eased, translated into aviation advances in civilian and military domains alike. In the hangar after the flight, Dittmar and his mechanics argued softly about adjustments, trim tabs, balance weights, a change in propellant mix. Each tweak sought to expand a few seconds of useful thrust. They knew that seconds meant targets and survival. They also knew that mechanical fixes could not answer strategic ones. A faster plane that could not be fed, repaired, or produced in mass remained an exquisite instrument with little leverage against a nation's industrial and logistical power. Some pilots weathered the transition better than machines. Chuck Yeager's philosophy was not aristocratic about speed. It was managerial. He measured patience as a tactic. If he could keep a bomber safe across 1,000 kilometers and return, that mission's cumulative effect on the campaign outweighed a single spectacular sortie. The calculus of victory sat in the margins: fuel per sortie, the ratio of trained crew to aircraft, and the maintenance man-hours required per flight. Yet romance clung to speed like varnish. Newspapers printed photos of sleek noses and shiny wings. Propaganda loved the image of the flash-out fighter. For aviators, there was an emotional truth to speed's appeal. In a pilot's life, to feel the machine shrug off the air and surge, to watch years of training distilled into a straight-line decision, was to touch a rare clarity. The emotional pull of speed will always challenge the sober arithmetic of logistics. When the smoke cleared and historians later tallied numbers, the verdict favored balance. The P-51 Mustang, with its combination of speed adequate for engagement, exceptional range, and maintainability in theater, multiplied Allied air power in a way the jets and rockets could not alone. The ME-262 and ME-163 displayed what speed could do. They did not, however, sustain air superiority. The rocket and the jet were foreshocks of the age to come, but the Mustang and similar designs shaped the immediate outcome. Henny Dittmar walked away from another test, boots on wet tarmac, hands empty save for a rag. He had tasted a velocity few men had, and he had lived to speak of it. His survival was a technical and human triumph,
But it did not alone redirect the strategic arc. For every dazzling ascent, there were dozens of steady patrol hours flown in Mustangs and Spitfires that, together, created the conditions for strategic bombing and for Allied advances. The question that had driven engineers, pilots, and commanders was simple yet stubborn. Who was king of the sky? But already, in report rooms and on blackboards and in the quiet dusk conversations of pilots, the contours of a final judgment were forming. Raw velocity dazzled, operational utility endured. The war would not be decided by a single flash. It would be decided by the cumulative power of machines kept airborne, pilots kept trained, and logistics kept functioning. Heine Dittmar stepped into the hangar and placed the canopy cover over the Comet like a shroud and a promise. Outside, the runway sleepers muttered as they went. Inside the hangar, engineers adjusted their calculations. The race for speed would go on, toward supersonic flight, toward jet airliners and guided missiles. But its wartime lessons about trade-offs were already clear and cruel. Speed must be usable to matter. A short debrief followed, then a ledger entry. Climb time, peak velocity, noted with caveat. Highest recorded under test conditions. Fuel consumption, structural notes. Across the room, a sheet of paper showed fighter escort hours, lost bombers, and sortie rates. Numbers, at last, tell the sum of human choices. They would be argued over for years, but the pattern was visible. When technology met logistics and doctrine, the result determined battle and, ultimately, history. The men who lived through it carried both pride and grief. The next flight would test another variable. What happens when speed is paired with heavier armament? What happens when jets are produced in greater numbers? These questions would press the engines and the men who steered them. For now, the field admitted a small, uneasy resolution. Speed astonished, endurance sustained. The rest was engineering and time. Heine lingered by the covered canopy until the lamp guttered. The hangar had emptied into a silence that tasted of oil and damp wool. Even the radios, set to low, muttered a gray, distant news. He folded his hands behind his back and let the cigarette smoke curl into the shadow like a pale question. He knew, as all who measured wings knew, that machines did not bear guilt or praise. Men did. Yet the ledger on the table, neat columns, small increments, kept reminding him that every entry translated into flesh and loss. A booted step halted behind him. Kramer, one of the older test pilots, stood with his helmet tucked under his arm. His face had a weathered patience, the kind earned by enough landings to teach humility. He had flown both piston and jet, and the two kinds of aircraft had written different kinds of sentences across his skin. He moved to the Comet and laid a gloved hand on the canopy cover as if steadying an animal about to wake. "You think she'll see many more days?" Kramer asked, voice low so as not to disturb the other dreams in the hangar. Heine considered the question in the terms he preferred, numbers and limits, and then let the human answer come. "Depends what you ask of her. If you ask for speed, yes. If you ask for patrol hours and escort days, no." Kramer laughed, not unkindly. "That is an engineer's answer. A pilot wants to know whether she will bring him back if the sky turns." That is not only an engineer's answer, Heine said. It is the ledger's last column. We can make her faster, but not for free. Fuel, metallurgy, tooling, everything has a weight. Kramer tapped the canopy twice and looked at Heine directly. We do not choose the scale of the war, Heine. We are given the measure of the tasks, and we try to match it. Some of us learn to live with small chances. Heine did not reply. He saw in his mind the equations he had drafted at night. Thrust curves, burn rates, center of gravity shifts as fuel drained. He remembered a test in which the combustion chamber had surged and the alarm lights had blossomed like warning flowers. He remembered a young pilot, the name tarred in his memory like a bruise, Bauer, who had not come back from a night scramble. The comet's speed had carried him into a night where no ground crew could find the thin trail of heat left by the engine. The ledger had marked no wreckage recovered. In the quiet hours, a ledger line can become a voice. Outside, far off, something fell. An aircraft, perhaps, or a transport losing altitude in the dark. The sound threaded through the winter, muffled, then gone. Kramer folded his arms and watched the runway, where sleepers shifted, and the small lights made a constellation of low expectations. There are conversations upstairs, he said, nodding toward the engineering offices. New orders about modifications. They want more armament, more range. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium thinks you can make a racehorse into a carriage. Heine smiled without mirth. They think time is elastic when money is spent. They forget that design is an argument with physics. To put on weight is to change the whole proposition, the center, the drag, the stall speed. We can fit a gun, we can fit another tank, but each addition takes from the thing that makes her special. Kramer stepped closer to the comet and lowered his voice. And yet, the bomber crews speak of speed as terror. They say the rockets come without warning. Maybe sometimes it is worth the cost. Heine's fingers found a rivet along the canopy rail. Terror is not an argument for sustainability. Besides, terror is not always on the right side of history. We measure by sorties, by sustained pressure. A terror that arrives once and never again does not win a campaign. They argued like this because men need to translate metal into meaning. Outside, far off, something fell. An aircraft, perhaps, or a transport losing altitude in the dark. The sound threaded through the winter, muffled, then gone. Kramer folded his arms and watched the runway, where sleepers shifted and the small lights made a constellation of low expectations. There are conversations upstairs, he said, nodding toward the engineering offices. New orders about modifications. They want more armament into a carriage. Heine smiled without mirth. They think time is elastic when money is spent. They forget that design is an argument with physics. To put on weight is to change the whole proposition, the center, the drag, the stall speed. We can fit a gun, we can fit another tank, but each addition takes from the thing that makes her special. Kramer stepped closer to the comet and lowered his voice. And yet, the bomber crews speak of speed as terror. They say the rockets come without warning. Maybe sometimes it is worth the cost. Heine's fingers found a rivet along the canopy rail. Terror is not an argument for sustainability. Besides, terror is not always on the right side of history. We measure by sorties, by sustained pressure. A terror that arrives once and never again does not win a campaign. They argued like this because men need to translate metal into meaning. Outside, far off, the night trimmed its edges with cold. Heaney thought of the supply runs that never arrived, the Allied raids on production lines, the bureaucratic notes from ministries that mistook slogans for programmatic reality. There had been plans, models with paper promise, of Comet wings in numbers, of squadrons of fast interceptors scrawled across strategy maps. Those plans decayed under the weight of raw materials and trained hands.
"This is tomorrow," Kramer said. "You will be there for the pre-flight." "I will." Heine's mind already sorted lists of torque, of seals to check, of a pump that hiccuped at low temperature. He moved to the bench where spanners lay like modest instruments of fate. He cleaned a wrench's jaw with a rag and thought of the roster. Names could be shuffled, experience could not. Pilots with night-hardened eyes were thin on the ground. Mechanics who could coax a Walter rocket engine to life were thinner still. The pre-flight began in the hush before dawn. Men with gloves across their palms moved in a choreography learned from thousands of such mornings. Hands on struts, fingers in the empennage, calls shared in clipped syllables. They worked with the kind of focus that made sound rare. Even their laughter was small and private. Heine watched them, making notes with a pocket light that trembled in the cold like a small pulse. The comets shone dully under artificial light. Its nose, sleek and uncompromising, held the promise of a curve where air would part unwillingly. Kramer performed the checks with the calm of a man who had made calculations with his whole body for years. He ran the fuel lines, listened to the pumps. The rocket's plumbing was merciless. One fault and the throat would surge. One misread mixture and the pilot would experience an instant of loss. Heine tightened a clamp and found the bolt had been newly installed. The supplier had replaced the batch with a lighter alloy. He recorded it in his pad with the slight anger of a man who knew the world was handing them poor materials and asking for miracles. The scramble came mid-morning, a blare on the radio and the staccato footsteps of men who had already dressed into urgency. Reports said a formation of 4-engine bombers had been sighted on the inland route, flanked by long-range escorts. They were heading for an industrial complex whose loss would bite the war's logistic chain. The Comet, with its blistering climb and brief fury, could intercept the bombers before the escorts reached operating altitude. In practice, theory required everything to be perfect. Kramer strapped in with the methodical attention of a priest performing a rite. His hands moved over the cockpit WEM, over switches and gauges that looked at the same time like lifelines and measuring sticks. He waved to Heine, who stood below the open canopy, and Heine saw in the pilot's eyes that stillness that allows a man to step forward. "Bring her back," Heine said. "I will," Kramer replied. The words were not a promise so much as an offered prayer. The rocket ignited with a sound like a brief, furious ocean. The change in pressure made the men in the hangar lean involuntarily. Kramer's silhouette was a black cut against the sky as the Comet slid upward, quickly swallowing altitude in a way piston aircraft dared not. The flight path arced like a thrown blade. From the ground, the interception looked like a sport of shadows. For a few minutes, the Comet closed with the bomber's stream, a single bright interlocutor among a phalanx of lumbering giants. It dove through a curtain of contrails, laid a quick path of fire,
And then, as the rocket fuel spent, it pulled away to glide. The whole engagement lasted the breadth of a cup of tea. The ledger would later record 1 successful engagement, no confirmed kills. In the immediate, though, something else had happened. The Comet's rocket had surged during relight attempts, a coughing that unsettled the pilot. Kramer radioed an odd, clipped message. Control, visual, engine pulsed, returning. Then static swallowed the line. Heaney, by then on the field with the recovery crew, watched the Comet glide down, a meteor that had exhausted itself too early. It landed with a heavy but controlled slam, wheels scraping, a thin spray of snow blown sideways. The canopy popped open, and Kramer climbed out, face pale and hands shaking. He told them about the surge and about the way the engine had hiccuped, as if refusing to obey. Kramer's report was swift, and the men set to work. The engine's combustion chamber bore the faint hammer marks of instability, little deformations where the flame had found new geometries. Heaney sat with his head bent over the chamber, tracing the pattern like an apprentice reading script. The metallurgy had been right for weight, wrong for endurance under those oscillations. Somewhere in the supply chain a choice had been made. Lighter alloy, quicker delivery. It had cost them a small miracle of sustained flight. That night, over a ration of coffee that tasted of metal and sugar, Heaney and Kramer talked about other things. About home farms, about children learning to ride bicycles on cold cement. Their conversation slid from personal refuge back to the ledger. The ministry wanted more sorties. The raw materials were less. The pilots were tired. "We patch," Kramer said simply. "We fly again." Heaney wanted to say that patching would not be enough, that the Comet's brief lightning would not solve a war built of attrition. But he had learned to hold dissent in the form of a plan. Report, test, redesign. Those were safe forms of rebellion. He wrote a proposal to stiffen the combustion chamber at the throat, to change the mix ratio slightly to reduce surging at low temperatures, to replace certain fasteners with heavier grades where critical. He folded the paper into an envelope and handed it to the liaison. He knew the paper would travel through great halls and land upon desks that prioritized other things. It would be read, perhaps docketed, perhaps buried under grander schemes. Days later came news of production losses. A factory on the Ruhr had been damaged in a raid. Components piled up like a broken language.
The men in the hangar felt the pressure translate into slowness. The time between sorties stretched. Parts were cannibalized. Hours on the flight clock dwindled. The Comet, which had seemed a narrow answer to a single problem, now looked like a delicate thing adrift in a sea of logistic failures. Yet men still climbed into those cockpits and folded themselves into the machines, because orders were orders, and because courage is not solely the property of victory. Heaney listened to the pilots return, their reports a mixture of technical phrase and exhausted human detail. The sound of flak at 5,000, the sight of parachutes like pale flowers, the slow arithmetic of how many rounds fired and how many had found metal. He learned to read the unsaid, the tightness in a quirked hand, the stiffer gait. Each pilot buried a story in the ledger's marginalia. One evening, late, a letter arrived addressed to Heaney. It bore no ministry seal, but an old friend's handwriting. Inside was a photograph of a little boy in a war-worn sweater, grinning with his knees drawn up on a stoop.
The note read, "Your work keeps men flying. Do not forget to eat." The signature was a name Heaney had not seen in years, a cousin who had escaped the city and now worked in a remote factory, making small things that might or might not be used for the front. Heaney folded the photograph into his pocket and found himself thinking of all the small things that accumulated into the warfare of flight. A rivet chosen because another batch had failed inspection, a boy's small hope for bread, the thin mercy of a pilot's skill. The ledger could not tally those things. It had no column for a cousin's smile. As winter loosened into a gray thaw, the engineering office received a new order. Explore ways to keep a jet in the air longer without sacrificing the burst speed that made it useful. It was not only them. Other factories were trying similar compromises, and the broader argument, the one that had begun in hushes over ledger pages, moved out into plans and models. The solution, Heaney thought, would not be a single invention, but a series of small reconciliations. Better alloys here, redesigned fuel tanks there, surprise redundancies in plumbing, a change in doctrine to use jets in concert with piston escorts rather than alone. He drew overnight and called pilots back to the bench to discuss the changes with the hands-on frankness that pilots respected. They spoke of angles of attack, of the disconcerting silence when fuel dropped below a certain mark, of the way the Comet demanded absolute commitment. There was no laziness in its flight. A pilot who hesitated would not survive. "We ask them to fly like they are on the edge," one said. "Then we must give them an aircraft that lets them step off that edge and come back." They invented small strategies, timed intercepts that synchronized rocket burns with escort gaps, maintenance checklists that emphasized choke valves and pressure differentials, and an adaptation in training that taught pilots to treat the Comet not like a sword, but like a brief, precise tool. The documentation thickened in the annexes, and Heaney's nights lengthened. Through it all, he kept the photograph near his lamp. In a city where decisions were often rhetorical thunder and little consequence, the hangar became a place of careful work and quieter conscience. Men argued not about glory, but about how to make a machine useful enough to justify the men who trusted it. The Comet remained a paradox, beautiful and harsh, miraculous and merciless. It could bite terror into the belly of a bomber stream and still be useless if the rest of the war refused to bend. On a late afternoon, as snow melted into a clay of mud and water, Kramer brought Heaney a small, battered book. Inside were notes from pilots, marginalia about approaches, sketches of throttle positions, shorthand that only those who had felt the machine shiver could read. "They made this for you," Kramer said, "not to flatter, to make sure the next time the rocket chokes, someone has written down what to do." Heaney read by lamplight and found in those casual notations the voice of a community that refused to let improvisation be fatal. The book was a ledger of another kind, memory in ink. He ran his finger along a page that described how to feather glide after engine cut, how to adjust control surfaces to keep energy while bleeding altitude. The notes were practical and humane, born of nights when a man had come back and lived to tell the shape of a near miss. Heaney thought then, as he often thought, that machines told stories about the societies that built them. That the comet demanded such intensity spoke to the pressures of the world it flew in. If speed could be had only by sacrificing endurance, then the society that required it had chosen a short, magnificent answer over something sustained. He wondered what those choices would write into history's ledger. He closed the book and walked once more to the covered comet, his shadow long across the hangar floor. He touched the canvas shroud, feeling the texture of the fabric and the warmth where daylight had lit it during the day. Outside, the runway sleepers had lit a lantern each and moved like silhouettes in a distant play. Heine folded his maps, stored his spanners, and for a moment allowed himself the small luxury of imagining an aircraft that combined both virtues, speed and stamina, not as an impossible dream, but as a design problem to be solved step by step. That image steadied him. He left the hangar, and the cold closed behind him like a judgment. In the morning, they would continue to trade in the small currencies of survival: metal, time, skill, and will. The ledger would grow. The comet would be examined anew.
The pilotos would continue to fly because there were orders and because they believed that their brief flashes of speed could, somehow, protect factories and homes. A guard called his name from the gate. He turned and watched one last contrail draw a white comma across the sky, a small, clean proof that men were still making tracks in the air. He lit a cigarette and inhaled, the smoke melting into the freezing air. The war had not decided yet which virtues would rule. He had no illusion that his calculations alone would sway it. But he had the ledger and the notebook and the hands of men who kept trying. They were, in their way, balancing the same equation that had begun a long time ago: how to keep machines aloft and men alive long enough for choices to matter. He walked toward the billet, the photograph of the boy warm against his chest, and thought of the ledger's final stubborn lesson. Technology, without the patient work of logistics and human endurance, remained a lightning flash. It could be admired and feared. It could not, by itself, win a war. The next months would teach more about resilience, about production, about training, and Heine intended to keep writing the margins that might one day convert flashes into days. He had not settled the argument, but he had added his hand to it, which, in the end, would have to be enough. At the billet, the stove sent up a thin, honest heat. Heine sat close enough to warm his hands, the photograph on his knee as if it might be scorched into permanence. Outside, boots sounded on frozen earth. Inside, a kettle hissed, and a radio murmured distant weather and orders in that flat voice of command. He folded the ledger's loose pages and laid them beside the photo, as if arranging tools for a work that would require both memory and motive. The next morning came with a gray so low it seemed to press the chimneys into the ground. In the hangar, the comet rested beneath its cloth like a horse under a blanket, awaiting the day it would be asked to run. Men moved with measured haste, a pump here, a wrench there, the small choreography of survival. Kramer found Heine near the tail, hands deep in oil-black gloves, and neither spoke at first. They let a silence of industry fill the space. "You read the notes all night?" Kramer finally asked, voice the color of a cigarette smoke. "Heard them," Heine corrected.
They stopped me imagining I knew everything. Kramer's laugh was short. Better that way. The men who flew it left their fears in the margins. Useful for the living. The briefing gathered them in a low room that smelled of damp wool and men who had learned to share cramped air. A map lay folded on the table, an array of pins and small red threads marking places no one said aloud. The commandeur stood at the head, his uniform neat, the medals on his chest flat against the cloth like questions.
Haney's lungs emptied and filled in one rhythm. Every notation in the ledger rose in his mind. The feather, the trim, the angle to lose altitude while keeping energy. He ran to his bench, grabbed a set of wrenches like a surgeon seizing instruments, though there was no surgeon in the sky to guide his motions. Outside, men clustered along the fence as if their eyes could become nets. Then the voice came again, steadier now. Throttle pulled, feathering, glide. Time seemed to slow in the hangar. The radio chatter was a chorus that needed only one voice to become a hymn. Merton's calm, steady breathing into the mic, the sound of a man reading the margins of survival. The comet shed speed and became the obedient shape of a gliding bird. From where Heine stood, he could see the silver arc of its descent, precise and terrible. Merton's landing was rough, an animalizing of machine and man, but it held. The comet skidded along the mud, threw up a plume of wet earth, and then ceased, as an enormous thing that had been on the edge of ruin found purchase and remained. Men swarmed, not in triumph, but in a haphazard gratitude, touching the skin and taking its pulse. Heine found Merton sitting on a crate, soaked, face smudged with oil and something that might have been relief. The younger man's hands were shaking less now, as if the act of having done what needed doing had steadied him. He looked at Heine and then at the notebook, as if recognizing a map that had guided him. "You wrote that down?" Mertens asked, thumb finding a margin. "Others did," Heine said. "I put it where someone might read it." Mertens laughed, a small, bitter thing. Lucky, if one can call it that. Heine felt a fullness in his throat that had nothing to do with victory. The ledger had done more than save a man that morning. It had begun to tilt arguments from glory toward endurance. He felt the weight of it, like responsibility. In the days that followed, the hangar's arguments softened at the edges. The commandeur continued to press for bold sorties, and some mornings ambition still had the upper hand. But the ledger kept a silent seat at the table. Pilots would add to it between missions, the angle at which a flap had saved a wing, the taste of a spark that preceded a cut. The book grew in both ink and authority, not because a single man had declared it so, but because it had proven itself in the most concrete terms, lives returned. Yet the ledger did not erase the larger question that had haunted Heine from the start. The comet was a blade. It cut both ways. Word traveled in fragments, burned towns beyond the front, refugee columns seen on maps as little flags, the steady subtraction of civilians caught under the precise arc of a machine meant for speed. Heine carried that knowledge like a new kind of torque in his hands. It altered the way he considered calibrations. If the machine could be used to protect, it could also be used to punish. The ledger contained tacit knowledge designed for survival, not moral calculus.
and that uneasy absence echoed empty as a hangar at night. One afternoon, Kramer brought him a letter folded along the creases of 1,000 similar letters. The handwriting was small, careful, the slant of someone who paused between thoughts, a woman's hand. Heaney did not have to open it to know which kind it was. He recognized the slow hope of the first lines when he read them, an inquiry, then a plea, and then, beneath, the quiet patience of someone making space for a response they knew might be long in coming. It was not addressed to him by name, but to a function, to the men who keep the machines. The letter asked about a plane seen in the far south, and whether Heine could confirm its model. It asked whether such speed might reach that town, and whether those inside could be warned. Heine read it twice, the second time feeling the words like wind-blown ash. The woman wrote of a child who liked to watch the sky and thought the planes were birds come to play. Heine folded the letter carefully and laid it on the bench. He thought of the photograph by the lamp, of boys who watched skies as if expecting angels. He had always believed that engineering was a conversation with reality. You ask, you try, you fail, you iterate. But now the questions came from the other side. Faces and towns and children whose only invention was the human hope that someone would choose to protect them. He went back to his machine. He stood before the comet and ran his hand along the seam, feeling cold metal and the slight give of rivets. He had not been the one to design its role. He was a responder to necessities and orders. Still, in the ledger and in his own growing list of margins, he saw ways to tilt outcomes, altering mission timings, suggesting altitudes that would lessen collateral drift, retraining pilots to favor interceptions over indiscriminate sweeps. None of these were grand solutions, but they were measures that might, in aggregate, turn strokes of lightning into longer arcs of careful light. He presented suggestions to the commandeur as quietly as a man offers a plan that might cost him approval. There were objections, fierce and immediate, the risk of missing the bomber, the economy of force. But Heine was persistent. He spoke not as an idealist in a vacuum, but as someone who had seen the ledger earn its keep. If speed is king, he said, let it be a just king. An officer laughed, the sound brittle. Justice is a luxury in war. Then let it be efficient justice, Heine answered. If we can reduce harm without sacrificing purpose, is that not also tactical? The argument did not resolve itself in a single meeting, but the ledger continued to accrue its quiet power. When pilots found that a slower intercept at a precise altitude could break up formations with fewer stray munitions, they noted it.
When an approach designed by the margins saved an exhausted man from a premature death, that too went into the book. Bit by bit, the machine's role in the larger moral balance shifted by degrees. Still, there were days when Heine woke and heard the distant din of bombs as a drum that would not be silenced. On such mornings, the ledger felt simultaneously like an anchor and like a confession. He would open it, find a note from a nameless hand. If the mixture falters, do not panic, reduce and feather, and see beneath it the human economy of survival, small acts that kept men breathing a little longer. In the hangar, seasons asked their mechanical questions of men and machines alike. Mud in spring clogged gear just as surely as frost had. A new supplier might change an alloy and cause a valve to fail.
Heine learned to expect the world to oppose ingenuity, and to find, again and again, that the ledger, those patient notations, was less a repository of triumphs than a chorus of remedies. One evening, as twilight braided with smoke from distant fires, a convoy arrived bearing wounded and broken wreckage. Mertens was among them again, this time walking slowly, aided by an older hand. Heine met him at the edge of light, and found that between them there was less need for words. Mertens held something folded against his chest, another sheet of paper, this one with a crude sketch and a single sentence. For the boy who watches, tell him to look away when the sky flares. Heine took the paper and felt it tremble. He thought of the woman's letter, of the child who watched the sky. He folded the sketch into his pocket like a talisman, and, for the first time since the machines had become the axis of so many decisions, he felt the ledger's scope broaden. It could not stop the war. It could not by itself choose mercy. But it could change the conversations inside rooms where choices were made. It could supply alternatives to the rhetoric of glory. Outside, a comet took off and cut a clean white line across a darkening sky. Heine watched until it became indistinguishable from the clouds. Then he went back to the hangar and wrote in the ledger a note about approach angle, a small correction to a diagram, an instruction for a pilot to signal in a different way. He dated it, initialed it, and closed the book as one closes a door on a room where a child is sleeping. There would be more flights, more nights when the ledger's margins were the difference between return and ruin. There would be orders that chafe and choices that seared. Heine did not imagine he could end the larger violence. That would be hubris. But he could continue to add lines to the notebook, small, stubborn additions that, in their aggregate, extended the lives of men, and, perhaps in the ripple, eased some of the war's cruelties.
Este é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência, e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. Esta é. Placed the ledger beside the photograph, then picked up the woman's letter and began a reply, not promising miracles, but telling her what could be done, routes to avoid, times when the sky was less busy, the small practices men could observe to lessen risk. He wrote in the mechanical hand of someone trained to communicate precisely, and when he sealed the envelope, he felt the ledger's ethic breathe into the act. At dusk, the hangar lights were tiny candles, each a small, deliberate insistence on warmth in a season of cold decisions. Heine stood between the machines and the men, and felt, as if by osmosis, the responsibility that came with making things that moved. He had not solved the problem of speed and endurance for a society bent on short answers. But he had found a way to keep adding margins where patience could be written, line by line, until, maybe, one day, the ledger's quiet instructions would shape not only how planes flew, but how those who commanded them thought about the skies they carved. A messenger arrived that night with orders for a mission at dawn. He read them and folded them inward, feeling the familiar weight of conflict. He set the ledger atop the bench, opened to a fresh page, and, with the practiced steadiness of a man who had seen how small interventions could become lifelines,
began to write the next margin. The night deepened. Outside, the runway lamps blinked like beacons waiting for a signal. Inside, Heine's lamp threw a small pool of light over inked lines that would guide men he might never meet. He signed the page and placed the ledger back beside the photograph, where the boy's face seemed to watch both the machine and the man who tended it. Heine did not know what the dawn would bring, only that he would be there to add another note, another margin, because that was the work he had chosen.